welcome back to our study on joy in the gospel in Philippians. Now, over the last month or so, we've talked a lot about theological concepts. We've talked about joy in suffering. We've talked about joy in humility. We've seen how Jesus has been an example of that. We're going to get a little bit more down to earth today in what we're going to be talking about, which is finding joy in friendships. And I want you to think about your friends. Do you feel like you have more, fewer, or the same amount of friends now as you did last year? Are you finding friendships easier or more difficult to form now that you're at UT, now that you're a year or two in your program, whatever stage you're in? Do you think it will be easier or more difficult for you in the future to make friends when you finish at UT? And why does that even matter? Why are we even talking about friends? This is a Bible study. Well, here are some surprising scientific findings about friendships. Friends keep you healthy. Having close friends has the same impact on your health as quitting smoking. As a matter of fact, if you aren't exercising, as great as we know exercise is for us, science has found making a new friend is better for you than starting an exercise habit when you don't have one. Keeping regular contact with 10 or more friends significantly increases our happiness levels and lengthens our lives. Friends help us better navigate decisions between self-indulgence and self-control. So if you're kind of like me and you're wanting to watch what you're eating, a good friend beside you can help you decide whether or not you've had a little stressful week and so that ice cream is actually okay. Or, hey, you said you wanted to watch what you were eating and this doesn't fit in that. Friends help us make those decisions a little bit better. A friend's mere presence also make our problems seem less severe. A friend's presence helps us rate our own self-worth higher. So when we're going through a difficult circumstance, we're less likely to pile on ourselves and think poorly of ourselves when we have a friend around. And a friend's presence also leads to less cortisol being produced in our brains. That's the stress hormone. So a friend just being around actually helps us experience less stress in the middle of difficult circumstances. Unfortunately, according to a May 2021 study that I found this week, the role of friends in the lives of Americans has experienced a pretty steep decline. Now, COVID's obviously played a role in that. We've lost contact with people. We haven't been able to be around people. COVID's just caused a lot of stress and a lot of disorder in our lives. But there are also other factors at play, and the study cited three. Now, the fact that particularly young adults are delaying marriage and are more geographically mobile. Like we're not tied to the place that we're born. We're able to branch out on our own, which in some ways is great. But it also leads to associated rates of social isolation and feelings of loneliness. American parents are also spending twice as much time with their kids than previous generations, which in some ways is great, but also leaves less time for friends, and I can testify to that. Americans are working longer hours and we're traveling more for work, resulting in less time for friends. Now, I'm not aware of anybody in our groups that has kids, but that will be a temptation probably for you, or not really a temptation, that will be a pro and a con for you at some point in your life, more than likely. The kids are great. They also take up your time, which leaves less time for friends. And working longer hours, your program demands a lot of you. You put a lot of work into your study, into your patience, and traveling. Like you guys get around still. Like you're able to go visit your family. You're able to go visit friends from college, take trips with them. Every now and then you go on a trip with somebody else in a program. There's somebody from here that you've made a connection with. Traveling is something that's really important to young adults. And so we give our time for that. And that's not that these things are bad in and of themselves. They just limit the time that we have to create new friendships. Now, we tend to have a high number of friends in college. We have fewer in our late 20s and 30s. And then the number begins to rebound. And it actually peaks. We have more friendships from the age of 65 on than we do at any other point in our lives. Now, friendships are important, not just because of their benefits to our own health, but because God has designed us for a relationship, or for relationships both with Him and with other people. The English writer John Donne is the one who's famous for saying, "No man is an island." And biblically speaking, no person is completely independent of other people, right? Like our actions impact and affect other people. We are impacted and affected by the actions of others. And God has made us for relationships with himself and others. But not just that, he's made us to need and desire relationship with himself and with other people. And it's really interesting. Some of these scientific studies have discovered that we actually experience more happiness and more joy the more friends that we have. So if we're talking about how do we find joy in the gospel, our passage today is really keying in on the fact that, hey, we're going to find joy in friendships. And there's two examples that we're going to read about. Paul has a relationship with both of these figures who are involved in this passage. They're guys named Timothy and Epaphroditus. Now we're going to learn about the circumstances of these friendships, what's made them friends, and how that might challenge us both to be a good friend and to build good friendships with other people. So first, just a little bit of context about what's going on in and around this passage and who the people involved are. And we obviously have Paul. He's the one who's writing the letter. Remember, he's in prison in Rome. Apparently, Timothy has been with him, and this guy named Epaphroditus has come to visit. We'll come back to both of those guys. Timothy is a young convert from a city called Lystra who accompanied Paul on his second missionary journey, and he becomes Paul's really close associate. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about that. Then we have this guy named Epaphroditus, who apparently was a leader in the church at Philippi, who was sent to Paul to bring a gift and to help him in his ministry, but something happens along the way there. So as we read the passages, I want you to notice the descriptors of the relationships that Paul has with both Timothy and with Epaphroditus. And Timothy is first, beginning in chapter 2, verse 19. I hope in the Lord Jesus to send Timothy to you soon, so that I too may be cheered by news of you. For I have no one like him who will be genuinely concerned for your welfare. For they all seek their own interests, not those of Jesus Christ. But you know Timothy's proven worth, how as a son with a father he has served me in the gospel. I hope therefore to send him just as soon as I see how it will go with me. And I trust in the Lord that shortly I myself will come also. So what I want us to notice here is that Paul and Timothy are friends through service together. Now, Paul trusts and has a really deep affection for Timothy. He says in verse 20, I have no one else like him. And then he gives a couple of reasons why he has no one else like him. He says Timothy's genuine in his concern for the church of Philippi in the last part of verse 20 and into verse 21. He says he's proven himself faithful in ministry. And he served alongside Paul. Paul says, I've seen these things in action in his life because he's been here with me. For Paul, sending Timothy is almost akin to visiting himself. There are other examples in the New Testament of Paul sending Timothy on, and his instruction is to receive Timothy like you would receive me, as if I'm coming to you. Paul described Timothy as his son in the faith. Like they're super, super close. And that all comes from the fact that Timothy, as a young man, left his home and went on this missionary journey with Paul. And you think about traveling in the ancient world, you think about the things that Paul did along these missionary journeys, right? He goes into new places, he shares the gospel, he experiences persecution, he gets kicked out, he has traveling issues, he goes back and visits churches that he planted and ministered at on his previous journey, and Timothy is along for the ride the whole time. And now, even as Paul's in prison, Timothy is there with him. They become really close. Timothy actually has 2 letters written to him in the New Testament. We have 1st and 2nd Timothy, and it's widely believed that 2nd Timothy is probably the last letter that Paul wrote before he was executed. So you think about, as you're about to die, who's the last person you want to communicate with? For Paul, it was Timothy. These guys are super, super close because they spent years traveling and serving alongside one another. Their relationship is forged and deepened through service, so that Paul trusts and cares about Timothy very deeply. Now, what about Epaphroditus? Picking up in verse 25. I have thought it necessary to send to you Epaphroditus, my brother and fellow worker and fellow soldier, and your messenger and minister to my need. For he has been longing for you all and has been distressed because you heard that he was ill. Indeed, he was ill, near to death. But God had mercy on him, and not only on him, but on me also, lest I should have sorrow upon sorrow. I am the more eager to send him, therefore, that you may rejoice at seeing him again, and that I may be less anxious. So receive him in the Lord with all joy, and honor such men, for he nearly died for the work of Christ, risking his life to complete what was lacking in your service to me. So whereas Paul and Timothy are friends through service, Paul and Epaphroditus are friends through trials. Now, remember, the church at Philippi sends Epaphroditus to Paul. He's delivering some sort of gift. We'll read about that in chapter 4. But then there also seems to be the expectation that Epaphroditus is going to stay and help Paul in some way, either help him while he's imprisoned, help him with his ministry, something like that. But somewhere along the way, he gets sick, whether it's on the journey there or when he's actually there. We're not 100% sure. But word gets back to the church that, hey, Epaphroditus has gotten ill. And Paul writes to tell them, and he wasn't just ill, like he almost died. And we think about this. Epaphroditus' mission is to come and help Paul. But when he arrives or when he's on the way, he gets sick. That's got to be really discouraging for him, right? Like he's not able to do the thing that he's sent to do. It's got to be a little discouraging for Paul. Paul's expecting some help. And now he's helping take care of this guy and helping to nurture his recovery. Like it's not exactly what he was expecting from this arrangement. And now that Epaphroditus is well, he's anxious to go home. Now, by all external measurements, Epaphroditus' mission is a failure. He hasn't been able to serve with Paul or take care of him. Instead, Paul's cared for Epaphroditus. He isn't going to stay and continue to serve with Paul. He's going home. But something's happened in this experience of illness with Paul and Epaphroditus. Paul tells the church in verse 29 through 30 to receive him in the Lord with all joy and honor such men, for he nearly died for the work of Christ, risking his life to complete what was lacking in your service to me. Epaphroditus hasn't been able to fulfill the mission for which he's been sent, but he and Paul have become close through this process of navigating his illness. Now, think about this. We have Epaphroditus who's sick and almost dying, Paul who's under arrest and potentially facing execution. He's not going to be executed yet, but he doesn't know that. He thinks he might be. And they get close through this shared experience of suffering and illness that was unexpected, that wasn't what either one of them really signed up for. Wasn't what they thought was going to happen here. And Paul now doesn't want Epaphroditus' illness to damage his reputation in the sight of the church, because his illness was beyond Epaphroditus' control. Like he didn't show up and decide to get sick. He didn't show up and completely flake out. He came willing, and something happened beyond his control that changed the dynamic. And here we see this evidence in Paul's life where, at least in this point in his life, he cares about the man over the mission. And he says, this man was willing to leave and to come and to work. And something happened that he couldn't control. And we've gotten close through the experience. And so I want you to honor him. I want you to receive him with joy, because he really did risk his life out of obedience. Now, he didn't plan on risking his life, but he did. They had walked through this trial that had led to Epaphroditus being near death, and they'd become close through it. I want to ask you, what's the state of your friendships? Like, the last year and a half has been really relationally challenging in a lot of ways, right? Like, we've been distant from others. We've not been able to gather with groups the way that we're accustomed to. Maybe your vacation or travel plans have gotten restricted. Maybe you've relied on Zoom and social media, which, in some ways that's really great, but it's also just not the same. At the same time, we're navigating a pandemic, protests, news and conversations about racial injustice and policing and everything that's related to that. We've had a contentious election. We've had conversations about war, masks, vaccines, and more. There are a lot of reasons that we could be divided and distant from others. And yet in the middle of all that, God has made us for relationships. Paul became close to Timothy through serving. Now, a couple years ago, I occasionally get the opportunity to write an article for this newspaper that our state organization puts out. And a few years ago, I got pretty curious about single adult ministries, because I've got a lot of students who, even when they graduate here, they're not married. Most churches are set up to go from college to young married. There's not a whole lot in the middle. And so I was curious about, hey, as a single adult, what are your perceptions of single adult ministries? And I just put a question out on Facebook like that, and I was really overwhelmed by the response. I got something like 40 responses from people, a lot of whom I hadn't spoken to in years. And the universal reaction or the universal perception of single adult ministries at churches was that they were not well liked. They were described as local versions of Christian Mingle, only trying to get you married, not really concerned, an awkward mix of 20-something singles and 50-year-old divorcees, and they just weren't really happy with it. And so then I followed up and said, okay, well, are you still involved with that church or another local church? And if they said yes, my next question was, okay, so what keeps you connected? What kept you coming back? How did you form relationships if it wasn't because of the single adult ministry where you were around other people in your similar stage of life? And the overwhelming response to that question was, I found a place to serve. I found a place where I cared about what was going on, and I got involved, and I built relationships with other people who weren't in the same stage of life as me, but we cared about the same things, and that process of serving together helped us build relationships, and those relationships have kept me here. We tend to think the other way, right? As long as we're sharing space with people who are like us, we should be able to develop friendships. And maybe that happens sometimes, but the overwhelming majority of people that I've spoken to in the last few years on the issue have said sharing space with people, even if they have a lot in common with you, doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be close. But when you find a place to plug in and serve alongside others, you develop deep relationships. So where are you serving? Paul became close to Epaphroditus through suffering. Now, when we're experiencing difficult circumstances and suffering, we tend to self-isolate. Like, at least I do, right? If somebody asks me what's going wrong, it doesn't matter if really all hell is breaking loose in my life. I'm going to say, no, I'm pretty fine. I'm okay. Thank you. Even when I'm offered help, even when I actually need it. Now, what would it look like if instead of that, I asked somebody for help? Hey, I'm actually really stressed right now. Do you think maybe you could help with X, Y, and Z? What would it look like for you if instead of going to someone and saying, hey, let me know if I can help? Because we know that really, people don't really ask for help. So if we know somebody's going through a difficult circumstance, instead of leaving it up to them, why don't we offer something concrete and say, hey, I've noticed that you seem to be really stressed recently, and I would like to meet you for lunch and just hear about what's going on and listen to you and see if I can help. Hey, I know that you have this really huge exam coming up. Can I bring you dinner the night before the exam so you just don't even have to worry about that? Like offering those practical steps in serving other people in the middle of their suffering instead of leaving it up to them and letting them tell you what to do makes a lot of difference. That was done for us as we navigated through COVID back in August. The small group leaders at the church we were going to found out, and they brought us dinner one night. They're like, hey, we're going to buy you dinner. What would you like from this place? Cool. That's great. And it was really well received. We appreciated it a lot. And it's just little small things like that we can do to serve other people in the middle of their suffering. And then also when we're suffering to actually speak up and to share and to say, I'm actually really struggling right now, and use that as an opportunity to build a relationship with somebody. Now, if you're feeling isolated, there's two things I want you to do this week. Number one, I want you to put some time on your calendar to call an old friend and catch up. Prior to COVID, I was starting to feel really relationally isolated myself, and I had decided that, okay, we're going to spend the next few months really pursuing relationships with people, because we've enjoyed our time in Memphis, but it's been really relationally difficult. We made some friends and then they moved away, and developing new relationships was really hard. And so we decided, my wife and I, hey, this is going to be a season where we're going to pursue that. Then COVID changes everything. We're not really able to do that for a period of time. So instead, what we did was we started intentionally pursuing old friends. And we'd call them, we'd set up Zoom dates. We caught up with people we hadn't spoken to in years. And nobody ever said, no, I'm too busy. The common refrain after every single one of those conversations was, I can't believe we waited so long. When can we do it again? Your friends want to hear from you, and you probably need to hear from them. So set aside some time to call an old friend and catch up, reconnect with people who have nourished your soul and your faith in the past. But then let's also be proactive about building relationships here, right? More friends equals more joy. So why don't we spread the joy to where we currently are? Let's find a place to serve. Ideally through your local church, but that may be through a local nonprofit organization. I can point you to a couple of pretty good ones. It might even be through the BCM. We're hoping and we're praying that God's going to bless this ministry, and we're going to continue to need new leaders, whether it's new community groups or some more outreach things that we have that we want to see happen in the near future. So if you're looking for a place to serve, I'd love to talk with you about what that might look like here. But I do really want to encourage you, to find a place to serve at your local church. There's going to be more people there. There's going to be more cross-generational stuff. There's probably going to be more opportunity. Check there first, and then let's talk about these other options. God made us for connection with himself and other people. So let's trust him enough to seek it out and to cultivate it and to prioritize it and to share with others in the middle of our suffering, to walk with them through the middle of their suffering, and to serve alongside others. We trust that when we do that, we will find joy in these friendships, ultimately rooted in the gospel of Christ.